And I just wondered if you could also share what some of the consequences of the hypervisibility and invisibility of Black people in mental health research.
Okay, well, thank you. This is another really big question, isn't it? And there's a bit of a paradox here, isn't there? On the one hand, in particular parts of mental health systems, particularly the coercive end of mental health care, Black people are hypervisible. So many of you will know that your risk of psychosis, of being diagnosed with psychosis, if you're of a Caribbean origin in the UK, is about 7 times, depending on who's doing the research and what measures you use, but it's about 7 times higher than the rate for a white British person. And that's not people who've just arrived from the Caribbean. We're talking about people whose grandparents and great-grandparents came from the Caribbean, and it's not dissimilar now. The rates are climbing now for people of Black African, sub-Saharan African descent. So really pretty shocking. So and that's linked to the way people come into services. So very often under blue light, so the police are involved. They've been sectioned under the Mental Health Act at kind of 4 times the rate of white British people. And that, I think, sets up in the mindset of some practitioners, or rather confirms in their mindset the link between Blackness and dangerousness. Some of you might have read, and if you haven't, I really recommend the book called The Protest Psychosis and How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease. And that's really worth reading, about how over time a condition that used to be primarily diagnosed amongst white middle class women shifted its focus and became a label attached to Black men around the time of the civil rights movement. And so, not surprisingly, not just the coercive end of mental health care, but also the prison system overflows with Black people. So that's a hypervisibility. But then in terms of the invisibility, you've got, and Stephanie's already alluded to this, that there are whole categories of mental illnesses where we know very little about Black people and their mental health. We just don't see them. And even within the hypervisibility categories, there's a lot that we don't understand. We know a lot about the epidemiology, which is often not problematized. So it's presented as, as a fact rather than maybe looking at some of the other things that are going on in the process. But that aside, I did my PhD in perinatal depression because I wanted to know how come I didn't know any Black women who talked about ever having postnatal depression, or ever being diagnosed with postnatal depression. For a long time, practitioners used to say, and there are still some who hold to the myth, that Black people don't self-harm. And we know that neither of those, those just 2 examples, we know that neither of those are true. Certainly the work that I did, about a quarter of the women in my sample met the threshold for diagnosis with moderate depression, mild to moderate depression. And whereas in terms of suicide, that we know that whereas white populations report higher rates of suicidal ideation, the rates of completed suicide are higher among young Black men and middle-aged Black women and South Asian women also than their white counterparts. And we also have invisibility in the research agenda for service users. So very often, people who are labelled as hard to reach, and for a long time we've known that that randomized controlled trials, it's really difficult to recruit people. This is the story, it's very difficult to recruit people from UK ethnic minorities into those trials, but they go ahead anyway. So maybe we'll pick that up in a little while. So moving on, so policy and practice, so invisible there. So especially Caribbean people, there are a lack of psychiatrists, psychologists, occupational therapists, and those key professional roles. Policymakers were not visible there, or commissioners. Senior leadership in the NHS is still regarded, it can still be said as the snowy white peaks of the NHS. It's still that's the case. And I've already mentioned research. So in terms of research, again, Stephanie has alluded to this, what is published and what is seen as valuable. So the kind of research that I started off doing and still really enjoy doing, which is talking to people about their experiences to better understand and inform service development, qualitative research doesn't even feature on the hierarchy of evidence, which has randomized controlled trials at the top. So people's voices are missing. And that means that and also when those studies are published, they tend to be published in lower impact journals. And that means you get limited funding. You know, that has implications for people's research careers. And that also then informs who becomes academics, how you progress through academia, and ultimately who gets to sit on those funding panels and, you know, research councils that set the research agenda. So it's invisibility all around. And I think, you know, the ultimate consequences are is exclusion and marginalization from an entire groups of people from the research process from start to finish.